They say there are things buried in the archives of history that were never meant to resurface. Records sealed, whispers dismissed, truths that, if spoken, begin to unravel the illusion that keeps ordinary men asleep. Tonight, I'm going to take you into one of those forgotten corridors. It begins in the winter of 1841, Salem County, New Jersey, a place where snow swallowed roads, where firelight was the only defense against the dark, and where a boy appeared at farmhouse doors like a phantom conjured from the storm. He was small, frail, with a voice that trembled like frozen glass. His eyes were a piercing blue, too sharp, too knowing for a child. To the families who opened their doors, he seemed an orphan, helpless. Christian duty demanded compassion, and in those Quaker households, no suffering child was turned away. But the boy they welcomed was not what he seemed. His name was Joshua Bennett, and he had not aged in 20 years. At 32, he bore the body of a 12-year-old, and behind that mask of innocence hid a mind sharpened into something predatory. This was no simple tale of pity and misfortune. Joshua was a master of human weakness, a student of faith, trust, and the fragility of the human heart. He understood that most men see only what they expect. When they saw a child, they lowered their guard. When they saw tears, they assumed purity. And when they heard words wrapped in scripture, they believed the voice of God was moving through him. He became the perfect intruder, not by force, but by permission. Families invited him into their homes, into their secrets, into the very vaults of their security. By the time they realized the depth of their error, it was already too late. Before we step into the snowstorm of 1841 and open the door to the boy who never grew, subscribe now, because this is knowledge you were never meant to hear. Salem County would become his stage, its people the unwitting cast in a drama of deception and betrayal. And this isn't just a ghost story of a boy who never grew. It's a lesson in how illusions are crafted, how appearances are weaponized, how entire communities can be manipulated by the very virtues they hold sacred. What Joshua did in those cold New Jersey winters reveals more than one predator's cunning. It exposes the deeper truth about control. That power doesn't always come from the strong crushing the weak. Sometimes it comes from the weak disguising themselves as helpless and letting the strong destroy themselves. So let us step deeper into the frozen fields of 1841, into the storm, into the night when Joshua Bennett first knocked on the Hartwell family's door and began to dismantle their world piece by piece. The Hartwell family had always believed their farmhouse was more fortress than home, a place where prayer, labor, and modest prosperity formed walls against the world's cruelty. Samuel Hartwell, stern Quaker farmer, had carved wealth from soil others dismissed as stubborn clay. His wife, Patience, embodied quiet discipline, her bonnet hiding the steel resolve of a woman who carried both faith and fear without complaint. Their children, Martha Thomas and little Rebecca, had known nothing but safety, the rhythm of harvest, the gentle tyranny of prayer, and the invisible barrier of trust that surrounded their household. But on that night, November 18th, 1841, the snow came down in sheets thick enough to erase the road, and the world seemed to dissolve into white silence. A knocking came at their door, soft at first, then desperate. When Samuel opened it, the lantern light fell on a figure half buried in storm, a boy of 12, trembling, lips blue, eyes like shards of winter sky. He whispered a story with just enough detail to cut at the heart, a family dead from fever, days of wandering without food or shelter, prayers unanswered. His name, he said, was Joseph Crawford. Patience did not hesitate. The door swung wider, the fire's glow beckoned him in, and as he crossed the threshold, the snow falling from his hair and shoulders, something else crossed too, a shadow the family did not see. Rebecca, coughing in her mother's arms, reached toward him with childlike sympathy, while Martha smiled at his timid words, and Thomas, suspicious but silent, studied him as if trying to measure what his eyes did not say. Joshua Bennett, Joseph Crawford, knew the game had begun. Every detail had been crafted for this moment. The tremor in his voice, the stutter placed carefully like a knife, the practiced collapse of his shoulders to mimic exhaustion. They believed him because they wanted to believe him, because their faith demanded they see innocence in suffering. And yet, there was something else. The boy's presence unsettled the silence of the room. His eyes lingered too long on Samuel's strongbox, on the silver gleam of spoons set neatly for supper, on the warm softness of family bonds he himself could never share. He smiled when spoken to, but there was calculation behind it, a hunger not born of starvation but of conquest. The storm outside raged on, but the true storm had already entered the Hartwell house, and the family, warmed by faith and blinded by trust, had no idea that they had just opened their door to the ruin of everything they thought was secure. The days that followed felt to the Hartwells like the unfolding of providence. The boy, Joseph, was no burden. He rose early, his small frame bent against the cold as he helped Thomas feed the animals. He swept the floors without complaint, bowed his head reverently during prayers, and even sang the old hymns with a trembling voice that moved patients to tears. To Samuel, who believed God tested men by sending strangers to their door, the boy was proof that his household's blessings had not gone unnoticed in heaven. Joshua played the role with precision. He did not overstay his welcome at the hearth, nor speak too boldly at the supper table. Instead, he let silence fill the gaps, the silence of the wounded, the orphan, the fragile. When spoken to, he answered in short, careful sentences, eyes lowered, smile hesitant. The Hartwells, like all good Christians, filled that silence with their own assumptions. Assumptions Joshua needed them to make. That he was innocent, that he was broken, that he was safe. But when the family retired for the night, when Samuel's snoring filled the rafters and Patience whispered prayers into her pillow, Joshua remained awake. His eyes adjusted to the glow of dying embers, scanning the room, noting every detail. He saw where Samuel placed the iron key after counting his coins. He noticed that Patience tucked her grandmother's gold locket beneath folded linens in a chest by the window. He watched Martha place a small brooch beside her hairbrush, as casually as one leaves bread upon the table. Each movement became a note in the silent symphony he was composing. The farm's rhythms were becoming his to command, and the family's trust, once a fortress, was already a door left ajar. Still, the boy's deception was not without danger. Thomas, sharp-eyed and restless, watched him differently than the others. He did not see a helpless orphan, but something harder to name. Perhaps it was the way Joseph's hands were calloused, more like a grown man's than a child's, or the way he seemed to know too much about farming, as if those lessons came not from tragedy, but from long years of experience. Suspicion flickered in Thomas's mind, though he buried it beneath politeness. Joshua noticed. He always noticed, and for the first time in years, as he laid awake in the Hartwell house, he felt something rare, an edge of risk, the faintest scent of exposure. The game was unfolding as planned, but the pieces on this board would not fall so easily. It began with the smallest thefts. A single penny lifted from Martha's drawer. A silver thimble gone from Patience's sewing basket. Items so insignificant they could be mistaken for carelessness or misplacement. Joshua understood the art of erosion. The way trust could be worn down not in a single blow, but in countless invisible cuts. Each vanished trinket was a test. Not of greed, but of perception. Would they notice? Would suspicion turn their eyes toward him? Or would love, that blinding human instinct, shield him from scrutiny? The answer came swiftly. The Hartwells saw nothing. Samuel, busy with the winter accounts, scarcely noticed the flow of small coins. Patience, worn thin from Rebecca's cuff, assumed her own forgetfulness. Martha shrugged off her missing thimble as though it had rolled beneath a floorboard. And so Joshua pressed further. By day, he played the obedient son. He chopped wood, carrying logs twice his size with a strength no child should possess, and when Thomas remarked on it, Joshua only laughed, feigning embarrassment. At night, he whispered scripture in a trembling voice, and Patience kissed his forehead as though he were one of her own. In that trust, he found cover. In their faith, he found the weapon he needed. Yet as his confidence grew, so too did the shadows around him. Thomas remained watchful. The boy's gaze cut sharper each day, measuring Joseph's movements with a suspicion he could not yet voice. One evening, as they tended the barn together, Thomas broke the silence. "You're awfully strong for someone who's been starving." His voice carried no malice, but it was a blade probing for weakness. Joshua smiled faintly, forced the practiced stutter into his voice. "Hard times, they make you strong. My pa, he taught me before the fever took him." The lie fell smooth from his lips, but inside, Joshua felt the old tension coil tight, because Thomas was not the only danger. Outside the Hartwell home, whispers had begun. In Salem's meeting houses, in kitchens and taverns, stories traveled of a strange boy appearing at doors, always alone, always with the same sad eyes, the same desperate tale. Families who had sheltered him discovered valuables missing, savings diminished, heirlooms gone. The community had no name for him yet, only unease. But unease has a way of spreading, and in time, unease becomes suspicion. Joshua had played this game for years, moving like smoke between towns. But in Salem County, the air felt heavier, less forgiving. He was still in control, but for the first time, he sensed it. The storm inside the house was beginning to mirror the storm outside. And storms, once begun, are not easily contained. December came hard that year, the kind of winter that makes the earth itself feel hostile. Rebecca's cough had worsened, and on the morning of the 14th, her fever spiked so high she slipped into delirium, whispering to shadows only she could see. Samuel's decision was swift. He would take the child by wagon through the frozen roads to Salem City, to the only physician he trusted. Patience would ride along to her sister's house for rest. That left Martha and Thomas behind with Joseph. The moment the wagon creaked away down the icy lane, Joshua felt it, the hollow silence of opportunity. Martha busied herself in the kitchen, preparing broth for Rebecca's return. Thomas trudged to the barn, fighting with frozen latches and chores too heavy for one pair of hands. The house was his. He moved quickly but without panic, every step rehearsed in silence over the last 3 weeks. Into the root cellar, where damp air clung like a shroud. There on the shelf between sacks of potatoes rested Samuel's strongbox. The iron key hung where it always did, carelessly, faithfully, on the nail behind the pickle barrel. Joshua's hand closed around it, cold metal biting into his palm like a brand. The lid creaked open, and what lay inside confirmed his calculations. Small leather pouches of gold and silver coins, carefully separated, their combined weight more fortune than most men would see in a lifetime. Deeds folded neatly, promissory notes from neighbors, even a diary. Samuel's ledger of not just his family's life, but his neighbors' financial weaknesses. Knowledge as valuable as coin in the right hands. Joshua did not take everything. He was too disciplined for that. He took half the money, reasoning that delay in discovery would serve him better than greed. A few deeds, a handful of notes, and Samuel's diary, all tucked away with the precision of a man who knew that wealth is not what you steal, but what you leave unseen. Then the locket, the silver frame, Martha's pearl brooch, the spoons. Their absence would cut deepest not for their worth, but for the violation they represented. The bag was hidden beneath his straw mattress before the Hartwells even noticed his absence. When Thomas called for help at the barn, Joshua went willingly, face bright with the innocence of a boy eager to please. No one saw the shadow of theft already coiled in his pocket. But even as he smiled, Joshua knew he was being watched. Not by Samuel, not by Patience, but by Thomas. And in the way the boy's eyes lingered, in the suspicion that sharpened with every passing day, Joshua felt something rare, the possibility that his disguise might finally fail. Days passed, and the Hartwell household carried on as though the storm outside was the only danger. But inside, an invisible fracture had begun to widen. The small thefts went unnoticed, of course, but the larger ones, coins, deeds, silver, began to whisper their absence in subtle ways. Samuel, exhausted from Rebecca's fever and the long journey to Salem City, delayed his usual Sunday count of the strongbox. Patience, distracted by care and prayer, assumed minor items were misplaced. But the missing pieces began to form a pattern, a faint shadow across the familiar rhythm of their home. When the family returned, the first inkling of violation came quietly. Samuel opened the strongbox to withdraw emergency funds for a doctor's visit. His eyes fell on empty pouches where gold should have been. The weight of the absence pressed down on him in a silence far heavier than snow. Nearly $200. His voice trembled, a mixture of disbelief and dread. Patience's hand flew to her chest as the realization sank in. Items they had assumed were merely mislaid were gone forever. The household descended into a measured panic, each member scrutinizing the familiar with suspicion sharpened by fear. The silver spoons from the kitchen vanished. The locket that belonged to Patience's grandmother, carefully kept beneath layers of clothing, was gone. Martha's pearl brooch, cherished and sentimental, disappeared as if swallowed by the house itself. Every corner turned revealed another loss, another betrayal invisible yet absolute. The family's suspicion turned inward, first toward workers, then neighbors, but alibis proved airtight. No one had access to the intimate knowledge required to orchestrate such precise thefts. The air grew heavy with unspoken questions. Trust, once unshakable, now felt brittle, like frozen ice cracking underfoot. It was Thomas who spoke what no one else dared. "What about Joseph?" His voice carried neither accusation nor fear, only the sharp clarity of observation. "He's been here over a month." The room fell into silence, each heartbeat a drum of tension. Eyes turned toward the boy, still innocent in posture, still small, still unthreatening to all but the sharpest mind. Joshua felt the shift immediately, the tightening of the net he had long controlled. For the first time, he faced a variable he had not accounted for, suspicion born not of greed or chance, but of intelligence. Thomas watched differently. He calculated, he questioned, and in that gaze, Joshua recognized the only threat that could undo him. Not force, not law, not even the cold of winter, but the piercing attention of a boy who refused to be deceived entirely. The stage was set. The hunter, for the first time, sensed a hunter in his midst. And the game, perfected over decades of human frailty, would now be tested by one boy's relentless scrutiny. Joshua knew the stakes had changed. Thomas's eyes followed him in ways he could not ignore. Every movement was measured, every word a potential trap. The boy's innocence had become an obstacle, a blade poised to cut through the web Joshua had woven so carefully. And yet, he could not afford to retreat. Retreat would expose weakness, and weakness in Salem County meant immediate suspicion, a community united in righteous scrutiny. He adapted. Every smile became more convincing, every gesture more childlike. He stumbled over chores on purpose, letting Martha notice, letting Thomas see the effort. At the same time, he kept the stolen treasures hidden beneath his straw mattress, meticulously ensuring they would not be discovered prematurely. He had learned over years of survival that patience was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Timing was everything. But Thomas did not relent. The older boy began subtle tests, questions about the farm, casual remarks designed to measure consistency. "Joseph, where did you learn to milk a cow like that?" he asked one morning, tilting his head. Joshua faltered only slightly, then recovered, recounting a tale of his father's farm in Millville, the story carefully constructed weeks before. Every word, every pause had been rehearsed in silence. Joshua began to notice patterns in Thomas's behavior, the way suspicion laced even his casual smiles, how he observed the movements of his family with careful precision. Joshua realized that to survive, he would need to manipulate not just the family's trust, but Thomas's perception itself. He began subtle suggestions, small lies embedded in moments of guidance, directing Thomas's conclusions away from himself. Like a chess master, he moved pieces invisibly, anticipating every counter, every question, every glance. Evenings were the most dangerous. Around the hearth, under the warm glow of firelight, Joshua played the perfect orphan, grateful, pious, devoted. He recited scripture with trembling reverence, offered insight to Martha with uncanny wisdom, and laughed with Thomas just enough to disarm suspicion. The family saw only the child they believed him to be. But behind the pale blue eyes, calculations churned, always churning, always searching for the next opportunity. He understood now that the real danger in Salem County was not the storm, not the cold, not even the risk of being caught. It was observation, the piercing, intelligent gaze of someone who refused to accept appearances at face value. And in Thomas Hartwell, Joshua had found such a gaze, a mind sharp enough to challenge his deception. Yet this challenge excited him. Danger, after all, was a companion Joshua had long known, a familiar thrill that sharpened his wits. The question was no longer if he could steal again. It was how elegantly, how invisibly, and how dangerously he could do so under the very eyes of a potential adversary. Joshua understood that raw stealth alone would no longer suffice. Thomas's suspicion required a different weapon: misdirection, subtlety, and the careful orchestration of perception. He began planting small, believable distractions, things left slightly out of place, minor chores performed incorrectly, moments of clumsiness that drew attention away from the treasures beneath his mattress. Each act was a calculated risk, a tiny thread pulled to control the attention of those around him. Even Martha, whose trust had seemed unwavering, became a tool in his design. He offered to help with chores in ways that left her feeling needed, competent, and protective. her attention focused outward on her own sense of purpose, rather than inward on the anomalies in Joseph's behavior. Patience, consumed by care for her sick daughter and faith in providence, remained blind to the carefully constructed narrative Joshua lived out before her. Samuel's confidence in the boy as a harmless orphan fortified every lie Joshua had ever told. At night, the boy sat quietly by the hearth, listening to family conversations, absorbing habits, cataloging movements. He learned which doors were locked, which windows allowed eavesdropping, how long it took Samuel to count coins, and which neighbors' visits left the household distracted just long enough to act. Every detail became a mental map, a grid of opportunity he could exploit with precision. Joshua also began to manipulate Thomas directly. Subtle compliments, carefully worded advice, moments of feigned vulnerability, each designed to both disarm and entangle the older boy's curiosity. He offered insight that seemed innocent but subtly guided Thomas's conclusions away from suspicion, creating a labyrinth of thought that only Joshua could navigate. The boy's mind, so sharp and probing, was now a puzzle Joshua relished. The thefts, once simple exercises in opportunity, had evolved into a psychological campaign. Joshua was no longer just a thief, he was a conductor orchestrating an entire household, every member a note in the symphony of deception. He understood human behavior intimately, knew how to twist faith, kindness, and trust into instruments of his control. And yet, for all his mastery, there was an undercurrent of tension, a whisper of vulnerability that Thomas represented. One misstep, one hesitation, and the entire facade could collapse. The thrill of danger was no longer abstract, it was immediate, intimate, a pulse Joshua could feel as he lay awake beneath the thin straw of his bed, listening to the soft breathing of a family unwittingly ensnared in his design. The boy who never grew had become more than a shadow at the doorstep. He had become a force, invisible yet omnipresent, shaping the world around him with patience, cunning, and the terrifying precision of a mind untouched by moral restraint. The household was changing almost imperceptibly. Joshua could feel it, the subtle shift in the air whenever Thomas entered a room. The boy's eyes lingered longer, scanning the corners, tracing patterns in movement that should have seemed ordinary. Joshua had always controlled perception like a puppeteer, but now the strings were taut, fraying at the edges. He had underestimated the persistence of intelligence. Joshua's thefts had become audacious, but with audacity came risk. A few coins, small trinkets, seemingly insignificant details were now noticed. Martha paused over missing items with a frown, her hands lingering over drawers as if trying to remember. Patience whispered to herself during prayers, subtly asking questions that pricked at the armor Joshua had built. And Thomas, quietly relentless, began cross-referencing times, routines, and alibis with a precision that unsettled even the boy who had deceived countless families before. One afternoon, Thomas cornered Joshua in the barn loft, feigning casual conversation. "Joseph, you always seem to know when to be helpful, and when not to be. How is it you know the right moment every time?" His tone was neutral, yet beneath it lay a sharpened edge, the first crack in Joshua's control. The question was innocuous, yet it threatened to unravel months of meticulous planning. Joshua forced the practiced stutter, the wide-eyed innocence, the trembling of a child unsure of his footing. I try to help," he replied. Every word was a thread in a delicate tapestry, and one false stitch could expose him. The boy's mind, seasoned by observation and instinct, began noticing inconsistencies, slight exaggerations in stories too, perfect timing in chores, moments of feigned helplessness. Joshua could feel the net tightening. This was no longer merely about what he had taken, it was about what they suspected, about the invisible weight of unspoken questions. Joshua understood the moment for subtle dominance. He allowed Thomas to see minor mistakes, small slips that encouraged a sense of control without exposing the true scale of his deception. Yet every concession was calculated, a psychological lure that bound Thomas's attention to false threads, distracting from the true depth of the crime. And yet there was a growing awareness, a sense that patience, observation, and intellect might converge to reveal the truth. The boy who never grew had always relied on invisibility, on being underestimated, but here in Salem County, for the first time, he confronted a mind that refused to underestimate him. The stage was set not for a theft alone, but for a clash of cunning, a duel of intelligence, manipulation, and the terrifying will to control. The first misstep came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow slipping past a candle's edge. Joshua, so accustomed to flawless control, allowed a hint of impatience to creep into his demeanor. Thomas noticed immediately small shifts in posture, hesitation in speech, a hand that lingered too long on a tool. The boy's mind, alert and relentless, catalogued these anomalies with precision. That evening, around the hearth, Joshua's charm wavered for the first time. He laughed too loudly at a story, recited scripture with an unnatural cadence, and offered advice that seemed almost rehearsed rather than heartfelt. Martha paused, exchanging a glance with Thomas, who nodded subtly, acknowledging what the others could not yet articulate. Something about Joseph was off. Joshua recognized the shift instantly. Suspicion had become palpable, a force pressing against the walls of his carefully constructed world. He retreated into caution, curbing gestures, softening tones, performing the role of the meek orphan with renewed intensity. But the mind that had orchestrated countless deceptions could not stop calculating. Every glance from Thomas, every whispered concern from Martha, every small question from Patience became data, feeding a growing pattern that Joshua struggled to control. The boy who never grew understood that subtlety was no longer enough. He needed audacity to survive. Night fell, and with it, the house settled into a fragile calm. Joshua lay awake beneath his straw mattress, listening to the slow rhythm of the household breathing. He counted not coins this time, but vulnerabilities' doors left unlocked, routines predictable, distractions that could be manipulated. He understood that missteps were dangerous, yet each misstep also presented an opportunity, a way to redirect suspicion, to deepen the illusion, to tighten the control without being detected. By the next morning, Thomas's scrutiny intensified. He asked questions about Joseph's past with casual curiosity, testing stories for consistency. He lingered in rooms longer than necessary, observing behaviors with a patience that mirrored Joshua's own. It was a quiet war of intellects, unseen by the rest of the family, each move deliberate, each response carefully calibrated. Joshua realized that the very qualities that had made him unstoppable, observation, patience, adaptability, were now mirrored by another. And in that reflection, he felt a rare, exhilarating tension, the thrill of confrontation not by force, but by mind. Salem County was no longer merely a hunting ground. It had become a battlefield of wits, and Joshua knew that one false move could unravel everything he had built. The first fissure in his carefully constructed world had formed. And once a fissure exists, even the smallest tremor can collapse the illusion entirely. Joshua understood that subtlety alone would no longer secure his position. Thomas's gaze had become a weight, a silent question that threatened to pierce the veil of deception. The boy who never grew realized that to survive, he needed to act boldly, to redirect attention, and to turn suspicion into distraction. He devised a plan, a psychological maneuver so delicate, it could either restore his dominance or destroy him entirely. He began by orchestrating small acts of apparent innocence, moments designed to cultivate trust while secretly shifting Thomas's focus elsewhere. He fumbled chores deliberately, miscounted eggs, spilled water on the floor, actions that seemed careless but were meticulously calculated. Each minor blunder drew Thomas's attention outward, toward observation rather than suspicion, planting the illusion that Joseph was a harmless, well-meaning child rather than the calculating predator beneath. Evenings became a theater of manipulation. Around the fire, Joshua laughed at Thomas's jokes, nodded with feigned admiration, offered guidance with a careful mix of humility and wisdom. He allowed Martha moments of influence, praising her insight in ways that subtly redirected her attention away from his own actions. Patience, consumed by her maternal duties and unwavering faith, became a living audience to his performance. Every interaction was a brushstroke in a painting of deception, and Joshua painted with precision born of decades of survival. Yet Thomas remained a challenge, the variable Joshua could never fully control. The boy asked questions, casual but sharp, probing the edges of stories carefully constructed months before. "Joseph, you've traveled far. Do you ever miss your family?" Each inquiry was a test, a way to measure consistency, and Joshua answered with practiced hesitation, each word layered with subtle misdirection. He sensed Thomas's mind mapping his actions, cataloging patterns, preparing for an inevitable confrontation. Joshua's audacity grew. He began small, deliberate provocations, leaving valuables slightly exposed, planting evidence that would lead Thomas's attention down false trails. It was a dangerous game, a psychological dance where one misstep could unravel months of careful work. And yet, the thrill of control, the intoxicating rush of shaping perception, bending the household to his will, drove him forward. In the quiet hours, as snow pressed against the windows and the hearth cast long, flickering shadows, Joshua felt the delicate balance of power shift subtly in his favor. Thomas's attention, sharpened and relentless, was momentarily guided away from the core of the deception. The boy who never grew had learned that domination required more than stealth. It required cunning, psychology, and the ability to weave illusion into the very fabric of trust. Salem County, with its sleeping farms and unsuspecting families, had become a stage. And Joshua Bennett, a boy frozen in time, was both actor and director in a drama of theft, manipulation, and invisible control. The air in the Hartwell home had changed. It wasn't anything tangible. No object moved, no sound out of place, but an undercurrent of unease threaded through the rooms, subtle yet insistent. Martha felt at first a cold prickle behind her neck, as if someone were watching even when all eyes seemed innocent. Thomas noticed it next, a quiet tension in the house that made him pause mid-task, glance over his shoulder, and question the boy who had become both companion and enigma. Joshua had seeded this feeling with deliberate precision, using silence, glances, and small inconsistencies to create doubt and distraction. He walked the halls with the measured steps of a predator, knowing that perception was everything. A creak here, a dropped object there, a sudden shiver of cold air. Each became a tool in his psychological arsenal. Patients noticed these subtle disturbances, whispered prayers, and fleeting unease, yet attributed them to the hardships of winter, to the drafts in the farmhouse, or to the weariness of caring for a sick child. She could not yet see the calculated hand behind them. Joshua's mastery was in invisibility, his ability to be present and absent simultaneously. In the kitchen, he smiled while Martha recounted village gossip, all the while noting which drawers were rarely locked, which windows gave a clear view of the yard, and how quickly Thomas would respond to disturbances. At night, when the household lay in quiet, he walked softly through rooms, cataloging each family member's habits, discovering the vulnerabilities he could exploit next. This was no longer about petty theft. Joshua had learned that fear, uncertainty, and subtle doubt could manipulate humans more effectively than any brute action. By creating tension, he made the family pliable, their trust fragmented and malleable. Each glance, each whispered question became a lever, moving minds as easily as he had moved coins and silverware. The boy who never grew had become an architect of psychological chaos. And yet, the deeper he wove his influence, the more intoxicating it became. Thomas's vigilance, Martha's unease, Patience's quiet prayer, they all fed him, like fuel to a fire, sharpening his awareness and confirming his control. Joshua realized that the true power wasn't in taking wealth. It was in dominating perception, bending the reality of those around him without them ever understanding how completely he had done so. For the Hartwells, the house had begun to feel alive with unseen currents, subtle manipulations that hinted at danger lurking behind innocence. And Joshua, a boy frozen in body but ancient in cunning, thrived in this space between trust and fear. Salem County had never seen anything like him, a creature of both light and shadow, exploiting faith, curiosity, and the unexamined nature of human kindness. Before we continue, if you feel the pull of hidden knowledge, comment, "I see the unseen," twice. Let the universe recognize your awakening, and let this descent into truth mark your presence. The fragile balance Joshua had maintained for weeks began to tremble. Thomas's curiosity had grown sharper, more relentless, and the boy's questions no longer brushed past Joshua's carefully constructed answers. Every story, every alibi, every feigned vulnerability was tested under the unyielding light of Thomas's observation. The once invisible predator began to sense the first real threat, not from force, but from the subtle power of suspicion that could unravel him faster than any lock or door. Joshua's movements became more deliberate, more calculated. He would pause mid-action, recalibrate his demeanor, and consider the consequences of each glance, each word. Yet even as he tightened his performance, he noticed the family beginning to notice patterns. Martha lingered near the strong box, her hands brushing over drawers and containers with a quiet awareness that made him tense. Patience, ever faithful and trusting, began to hesitate, questioning small things that would have seemed inconsequential before. Even little Rebecca, with her childish intuition sharpened by recent illness, watched him with cautious eyes. Joshua recognized the danger and embraced it. The boy who never grew had always thrived in chaos, and now the first true tremors of it were unfolding. He began introducing controlled misdirection, planting evidence of misplaced coins, creating small distractions to draw Thomas's gaze away from critical items, and rehearsing conversations with such meticulous care that the family might mistake them for coincidence. Yet the tension was undeniable. Thomas's gaze had become a silent interrogation, a measuring of truth against performance. The psychological stakes were higher than ever. Joshua realized that domination through subtle manipulation required both patience and audacity, and that one slip could expose the depth of his crimes. He began testing the boundaries, allowing small hints of his knowledge to surface, observing reactions, gauging which threads of fear or trust could be pulled next. The house, once his stage, now felt like a chessboard where each family member was a piece capable of unexpected moves. For the first time, Joshua felt a pulse of genuine vulnerability. The boy who had never aged, who had stolen from dozens without consequence, now confronted the possibility of exposure, not by brute strength, but by the piercing intelligence of a single observant mind. Yet even in this tension, he found exhilaration, an intoxicating mix of danger and mastery that reaffirmed his need to control perception, bending reality around him like smoke. Salem County was no longer merely a backdrop for theft, it had become a theater of psychological warfare. Joshua's mind, brilliant and dark, was locked in silent combat with Thomas's relentless scrutiny, and in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, the first true fear began to take shape, that the boy who never grew might finally meet an intellect capable of seeing through him. The tension in the Hartwell household reached a boiling point. Thomas's scrutiny, once subtle and calculating, had sharpened into something relentless. Every glance, every word, every movement of Joshua's was measured, analyzed, and catalogued. The boy who never grew felt the invisible walls closing in, the delicate illusion of trust fraying at the edges. Salem County, with its quiet, snow-draped farms and unsuspecting families, had become a crucible, and Joshua now faced a threat more dangerous than any door or lock exposure. That night, as the household slept, Joshua moved silently through the rooms. Each creak of floorboard, each whisper of wind through the shutters became an echo of possibility, a reminder that one misstep could undo months of meticulous planning. He paused in Thomas's doorway, listening to the steady rise and fall of the boy's breathing, noting the faint glow of moonlight on the floor. He realized that Thomas's mind had become a mirror of his own, methodical, observant, and unwilling to accept deception. For the first time, Joshua felt the thrill of danger tempered by genuine uncertainty. The following morning, subtle confrontations began. Thomas questioned the whereabouts of small items, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Martha noticed discrepancies in Joseph's stories, prompting questions that Joshua deflected with practiced ease but growing difficulty. Patience, too, sensed unease, her maternal instincts whispering that something was amiss. The boy who never grew had always relied on patience and distraction, yet now each subtle manipulation required exponentially greater effort to maintain the illusion. Joshua began pushing boundaries, escalating his psychological games. He left small clues, minor inconsistencies meant to draw suspicion elsewhere, to guide Thomas down false trails, to distract the family from the true extent of his operations. But even as he orchestrated these diversions, he recognized the risk. The tighter the web, the more visible the threads. Each act of deception now carried weight, and one misjudgment could unravel the entire house of trust he had so carefully built. In the quiet moments, Joshua contemplated the rarity of this challenge. No family had ever tested him like this. No mind had ever mirrored his own cunning, his capacity for observation, his hunger for control. The boy who never grew realized that Salem County had become a battlefield of intellect, manipulation, and psychological dominance. And in that realization, a new exhilaration surged, a dangerous awareness that the game had changed. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. Joshua's illusions would soon be challenged not by strength, but by perception. The predator behind the child's face was about to encounter the first true resistance, a force capable of piercing the veil of deception and exposing the dark brilliance beneath. The inevitable confrontation arrived on a bitter December evening. Snow lay thick across the Hartwell farm, muffling sound and cloaking the world in deceptive silence. Joshua, small and fragile in appearance, moved with his usual precision, yet every instinct screamed caution. Thomas had become more than an observer. He was a hunter in his own right, his mind attuned to deception, his intuition sharpened by weeks of subtle clues. Joshua sensed it, the net tightening around him, invisible yet undeniable. That night, Thomas cornered him in the barn, away from the warmth of the hearth, where shadows twisted against wooden beams like living things. The boy's blue eyes, once wide with trust and admiration, now bore a quiet intensity that struck at Joshua's carefully constructed confidence. "Joseph," Thomas began, voice steady, "we know things have gone missing. We know you're not who you say you are. Tell us the truth." There was no malice in the tone, only measured authority, the authority of a mind unwilling to be fooled, unwilling to yield. Joshua felt a surge of fear he had not known in decades. His brilliance had always been enough, his manipulation flawless, his control absolute. Yet here was a boy who saw through every layer, every practiced gesture, every carefully woven lie. For the first time, the predator faced vulnerability, the intoxicating, paralyzing vulnerability of exposure. He searched for the right words, the perfect deflection, but nothing satisfied the quiet pressure emanating from Thomas's unwavering gaze. And then, in a flash of instinct, Joshua acted, not with force, but with confession, a carefully measured surrender designed to preserve what remained of his control. He admitted to small thefts, to minor manipulations, his words laced with charm and remorse. Yet even this was a performance, a last effort to bend perception, to salvage trust, to survive. Thomas listened, weighing every nuance, and then, with a quiet nod, allowed the boy to leave. Not punished, not celebrated, simply released. An acknowledgement that the predator could exist in the shadows, but never dominate the light that sought truth. Joshua vanished into the New Jersey wilderness, like smoke over frozen fields, leaving behind the Hartwell family forever changed. He had taken wealth, yes, but the more profound theft had been of their innocence, their unquestioning faith in appearances. The boy who never grew remained. In the annals of Salem County, a ghost of cunning, a whisper of fear, a reminder that intelligence without empathy is a dangerous weapon. For those who study his story, there is a lesson far darker than lost silver or pearls. Mastery of the mind can shape reality, bend trust, and manipulate perception beyond comprehension. Joshua Bennett's life proves that appearances deceive, and that evil often wears the most innocent mask. Salem County remembers him not only for what he took, but for the truth he revealed. The truth that men, regardless of age or size, can wield intellect as a weapon far more lethal than any blade. And so, the boy who never grew remains a specter of psychological terror, a cautionary tale that even in small frames, immense darkness can dwell, waiting for the opportune moment to awaken. Those who encounter such truths are forever changed, their understanding of trust, perception, and human vulnerability deepened, and perhaps, quietly, haunted.